I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the new Polestar 2. The Polestar 2 is the latest electric vehicle to jump off the blocks here in Australia. A new round of EV incentives is really starting to change the game, and I guess the calculus for whether or not a car maker sends EVs to our market. Here in New South Wales, where I'm reporting from today, there's pretty significant financial incentives for buying a new EV, including some grades of the Polestar 2. Now, the one behind me I have is the long-range single motor variant, and the biggest way that it differs from a Tesla Model 3, for instance, which this car is absolutely designed to go up against, is that the Polestar 2 is front-wheel drive if it's got a single motor and all-wheel drive if it has dual motor. The long-range single motor is going to be the volume seller, Polestar tell us. So in today's video, we're going to be getting all of our first impressions of this new mid-size EV out onto the table. And I think that's the first comment I'd make. It's an EV that isn't an SUV, which is just great. The skateboard platform form factor that most EVs take really suits SUVs, so it's really good to see car makers experimenting with it and not going with a crossover shape just by default. You can probably tell the Polestar 2 does ride a little bit higher than similar sedans like the Volvo S60, which doesn't share a platform with this car, and so it has a nice big 75 kilowatt hour battery usable nestled between the axles. That gives you a range of up to 540 kilometers WLTP. We haven't quite managed that today, but I'll get more into that when we discuss the running costs and the driving dynamics of this new electric car. But before we get started, make sure to hit subscribe down below. There are two main reasons why this car's chief rival, the Tesla Model 3, has been so successful here in Australia. The first is superchargers, which this car doesn't have access to. Instead, you've got to use the other chargers that you see out and about that are sort of non-brand specific. I'll come to how well that works later. The second reason though is that the Model 3 has been available for under 60 grand for at least a few months now. Now, when we got pricing for the Polestar 2, it was clear this car had one big target, and its name was Model 3, because you can get into a standard range Polestar 2 for actually slightly cheaper than a Tesla Model 3, which is cool. Now, this car, the volume seller, the long range single motor, it's $64,990. And this car we're sitting in has two option packs, the Plus pack and the Pilot pack. And that brings the price of this vehicle to more like 76 grand than 65 grand. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But if you do that, as most customers probably will, you end up with a pretty complete car. Now, the Plus pack is all about comfort. Now, as standard, the car doesn't have fully electric seats, for instance. It does get heated seats as standard, but you have some of the ways of movement being manual. With the Plus pack, both the driver and the front passenger get fully electric movement, plus memory for the driver, which is always really nice. You also get upgraded from a standard 250 watt stereo to a 600 watt 13 speaker Harman Kardon unit that sounds really great. But what's common to all Polestar 2s is this 11-inch Google-driven operating system in the center touchscreen. Now, as you would expect, it's incredibly snappy, it's crisp. To be completely honest with you, fingerprints show up on it a little bit more than what I would have expected. Same goes for the piano black trim down here. But the operating system is intuitive, it's easy to understand, and you also get Google Assistant for voice commands, which is all very well, but this car has its own inbuilt LTE connection. And one thing I noticed was that the connection itself in this car was very patchy. So about half of the time my commands were ignored because the car didn't have internet connection. The integrated Spotify app, which is cool, only works if the car has a data connection. So when it drops out, so does your music, so does the ability to browse. So that's something that clearly needs to be fixed up because it's too inconsistent. I ended up pairing my phone, listening to Bluetooth music through the Harman Kardon. That all works really well. In front of us, we have a digital instrument cluster, very progressive design, no sort of fake tachometers or anything like that. Instead, you just get your speed, you get a power graph, and you get your range. All very easy. You can bring up extra trip computer information if you want to, but you can't see your media in this screen. You get a choice of just data or data and a Google map. That's it. On Volvos of old, you were also able to see your song title. That seems to have been deleted in this Polestar, as well as new Volvos that share the Google Android-based system. Now, there's no leather in this interior. It's a vegan interior. That includes these weave tech seats. They certainly feel okay. I think Polestar could probably do a little better with replicating a more premium material. This just kind of feels like neoprene, and it's a material that runs pretty hot. So I felt my back getting a bit sweaty, and this car doesn't have cooled seats. So in high summer, underneath this glass roof, that will be interesting. But the comfort levels are pretty good. The support is good. The view out is decent. There's a fairly narrow aperture on this glass here, but you get really cool big side mirrors. The glass house is fairly conventional. And in terms of practicality, we've got wireless charging, 2 USB-C ports. We've got a little cup holder down here, another cup holder under this shifting center armrest. And I will just point out the mix of materials on the dash. Same sort of neoprene dash material, but then really cool textile and also open pore wood. So it all comes off looking very classy. I know I just spent 30 seconds kind of slagging off the interior upholstery of the Polestar 2, which I just think could have gone slightly higher level. One thing I will say though, is it is nicer than the vegan leather you get in the Tesla Model 3, because I've never been sweatier than when I was driving that car. And for reference, I actually don't sweat that much. So, you know, this is an improvement, but I still think EV makers are they need to make the next leap towards inventing a textile that is truly sumptuous and a proper replacement for animal skin. I know a lot of people have ethical concerns with real leather, and that's totally fair enough, but we need a textile that is kind of as nice and as temperate to sit on, in my opinion. Now that diatribe's over, let's talk about room in the back seat. So for myself at 6 foot, headroom, I've got about an inch of it, that's okay. Legroom's good, toe room's pretty constricted, but I don't have that much less room than I would have in, say, a Volvo XC40 Recharge. And because we have kind of stadium seating here, the view out is good, so kids aren't going to get too car sick. We've got air vents, same sort of beautiful knurling as a current gen Volvo. We've got heated rear seats because of that plus pack, and we have 2 more powered USB-C ports, map pockets in both seats, flip down armrest, 40-20-40 rear seat, which is great if you like to go skiing and you're thinking about buying perhaps the all-wheel drive version of this car. And actually underneath these textiles here, we have more speakers for the Harman Kardon, which is pretty cool. All soft materials here, so it feels kind of bright and airy because of this gray interior, and it all feels very complete. I will also say that quality feels absolutely rock solid in this car. It is built in China, like a lot of current gen Volvos, like the Tesla Model 3 for Australia, but it's screwed together really, really well, this particular example. Moving around here to the back of the new Polestar 2, you'll have to excuse the fact it's a bit grubby, but as you can see, it's a very, well, it's a day for Volvos, I guess, and the Polestar sort of fits into that category. Now, I'm a big fan of the design with this single piece LED light heck blender here around the back. The Polestar badging in white, also very cool. Obviously no tailpipes, being designed as a pure EV, and also no Polestar 2 badging. So there is a little sticker on the doors which tells you, but I personally think I'd be removing that because it sort of advertises how much power the car has. Feels like a bit of a wank, if I'm honest. Anyway, power tailgate, and it's a hatch, which is great. So you've got this big aperture to get stuff in. Only 405 litres, probably because the floor of the boot is pretty high, but it's still a good practical square space. And we've got a few Volvo derived features like the grocery bag holder with hooks, that's cool. But underneath the boot floor, you won't find a spare. Instead, there's just a big hole where you could put your charging cables. This car's got the travel cable with a 3-pin end to it, but if you bought your own Type 2 cable, there's more than enough space to get it in there. Whereas under the conventional boot floor around the back, there's no spare wheel. Instead, there's just a space for charging cables. Here under the frunk, which is accessed via a sort of traditional latch, you'll find a little bit of extra storage space. Now, like a good EV, there was no space left under here for a combustion engine. So instead we have this sort of freed up area. It is flock lined. Now it's not massive. You might get a briefcase or a soft bag in here, I guess, but underneath here you'll find a tire inflation kit. You've got your goo, you've got your compressor, you've got your warning triangle. Over here you have the reservoir for the wiper fluid, which is cool. Now, what I will say is it's not quite as big as a Tesla Model 3's frunk, and it's especially not as big as that on a Porsche Taycan, where you can actually get a overhead cabin bag into the front, which is really nice in terms of practicality. But what's it going to cost you to run a Polestar 2? Well, buying an electric vehicle is expensive at first, although they are starting to get a little bit cheaper, including this car, but it's the running costs where you really get the payoff. It used to be the case that buying an electric car was the expensive part and running it was the cheap part, but now that Polestar are clearly aggressively targeting the Tesla Model 3, this sort of premium / entry-level luxury car isn't even that expensive compared to vehicles, even combustion vehicles that it competes with. However, the running costs are quite a lot cheaper than something similar like a Volvo S60. Firstly, with servicing, you only have to bring the Polestar 2 in for a service every 2 years or 30,000 kilometers. That's because EVs have so many fewer moving parts. We have seen a few comments from people asking why an EV needs to be serviced at all. It's largely about inspection. Do the brakes need changing? Are there any issues with the suspension components? There are some fluids still left over in these cars. It's really all about that. The little nitty-gritty bits and bobs for software, that can all be done over the air with this car, much like on a Tesla. The warranty for the Polestar 2 is 5 years with unlimited kilometers. For the battery and the electric components, it's 8 years, 160,000 kilometers. And in terms of energy consumption, the long-range single motor is rated for 17.1 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. On my mix test, which did have a bit of dynamic driving thrown in today, I managed 20 kilowatt hours per 100 Ks, but I look forward to seeing what this vehicle is capable of in sort of day-to-day driving that's a little bit more reminiscent of what most of us would do. Why don't we start with the basics for any EV, which are battery size, range, and consumption. Now, with the Polestar 2, there is a 61 kilowatt hour usable single motor short range or standard range variant as a price leader for the range, which starts under 60 grand. But the two long range cars share a 75 kilowatt hour usable battery. And that's a pretty decently sized battery. And that's a good thing because the Polestar 2 just isn't as efficient as a Tesla Model 3. It's just not. Tesla's main area that they dominate is in battery tech and efficiency, and the Model 3 can really return sort of sub 14 kilowatt hours per 100 Ks without trying all that hard. Whereas in the Polestar 2, I was able to get 20 on a mixed drive. It did include a bit of dynamic driving, you know, trying to extract a bit of performance out of the single motor variant here. You know, settling down, you can kind of get that to 18 kilowatt hours per 100 Ks without all that much effort. But you can kind of see it's like 20-25% less efficient than a Model 3 in similar driving conditions. Now, that doesn't strike out the Polestar 2 from consideration, in my opinion, because I sort of perceive in my mind that 400 kilometer range as being pretty useful for people here in Australia. A bunch of EV infrastructure companies are targeting sort of 200 kilometer gaps between their rapid charges in country areas, and so 400 Ks of range gives you a little bit of headroom there. Certainly would 500, 600 kilometers of range be even better in a big country like this? Yes, but let's remember it's early days, and the Polestar 2 doesn't have to be the car that carries all of that weight on behalf of the industry. It's just one of many factors. Because on a bunch of other metrics, the Polestar 2 is actually really pleasant to drive, and it feels up there with premium EVs like the Tesla Model 3, and certainly, you know, kind of head and shoulders above car-based stuff like the Hyundai Kona electric and the Kia Niro, and even the Nissan Leaf, which, you know, has been a very long-standing EV, but it ain't that cheap in Australia, and it feels generations behind the Polestar 2 in terms of driving dynamics, and especially in terms of design and fit out. Now, we've already had a static look at the car. I think it really looks lovely getting down the road, and the interior is great, and particularly if you're not a huge fan of that single piece 15-inch slate tablet that you get in a Model 3 for controlling all of the functions, this interior feels familiar. It's certainly progressive. We do have a big vertical touchscreen. We've got a really lovely digital display, but it's familiar. It's laid out like a car. You still have the kind of cool EV-ness of just get in and go, where you can literally just get in the car with the key, select drive or forwards gear, as it should really be probably known, and set off. There's no push button start or anything like that. So, you know, there's definitely elements of progressiveness here, but there's also some throwback stuff to it, which in a way is fine, because I don't really believe in throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and a good car interior is just a good car interior, no matter if it's fed by petrol, diesel, electricity, hydrogen, you name it. Now, the interesting thing about the Polestar 2 is its front drive, so very similar to Volvo's in that sense. The single motor is front drive. The dual motor, which is the top of the range variant for the Polestar 2, has all-wheel drive. But in the single motor, it's still relatively potent, 170 kilowatts of power and 330 Newton meters of torque. And immediately driving this car, I was reminded of it feeling like a electric Skoda Octavia RS. That's kind of what came to mind when giving this car a bit of a punt, both in the suburbs and on a country road. It feels more like that kind of balance than, say, an electric Volvo S60. So that is to say, in a long sense, that it's pretty well set up, the chassis of this car. EV makers make a lot of noise about skateboard batteries and low center of gravity and all that sort of thing, but that actually doesn't kind of create a car that handles well without further tuning. And it's clear that Polestar have actually put in the time and effort to set up the chassis of this vehicle really well, because it handles really nicely. I think the handling is actually a little bit better than some variants of the Tesla Model 3, even though it's rear-wheel drive. Certainly you need to be a bit more patient on the throttle because you don't have the push effect from the rear. Instead, the same wheels that do the turning also have to do the driving. Don't get me wrong, I'm a rear drive purist. I own 2 rear-wheel drive vehicles. I get it. But I think that there's been very, very careful chassis tuning here on the Polestar 2 that's generated a car that's pretty fun to drive and pretty secure, even on a wet and rainy day like this. Haven't driven the all-wheel drive version yet. Looking forward to doing that soon. Now, where you can feel the effect of the mass, because being an EV with a 75 kilowatt hour battery, it's not light. Volvo quote just over 2,000 kilograms. We independently weighed the car and it came in at 2,060 kilograms, which is a lot for a mid-size sedan. You feel the weight when it sort of clonks into potholes around town. Not only is the car heavy, we've got big, heavy 20-inch alloy wheels on this car, and they do find potholes. On a badly broken up concrete road, the kind that we get here in Sydney, where a lot of roads were built on a sand base, the ride can be quite tiring actually. But it's no worse than the Model 3 in that sense, which also doesn't ride well. There are lots of good things about Tesla's Model 3 and their other vehicles, but ride tends to not be one of them. And so I don't think the Polestar's any worse. In fact, I think it's better, because when the road evens out, when you're looking at what appears to be a smooth road, the suspension of this car does not fidget. And in my recent review of the Model 3 long range, I found that it just had a suspension that never settles, even on flat roads. And that is not a software thing. It can't be fixed over the air. It is all about the dampers and the way the suspension hardware is set up. And Polestar have done a good job of sorting the hardware for this suspension, even if mass is working against them and inertia at times is working against them. It is a product of EVs being very heavy, and one of the reasons why solid state batteries can and should be the next advance in terms of bringing weight down, as well as all the efficiency benefits that they offer. Speaking of efficiency, you can't review an EV without talking about charging, or at least you shouldn't. And the long-range versions of the Polestar 2 can take DC rapid charging at speeds of up to 155 kilowatts, which is pretty competitive actually. I plugged it in at our local rapid charger. Look, it already had high 60s in terms of a percentage, but it quickly swung up to sort of 60, 70 kilowatts. So I can see that with a lower state of charge, you'd be getting into the triple figures for charging without too much of an issue. But this car can't match Tesla's supercharger network. While Australia is coming along in terms of EV charging infrastructure, it's simply not a match for the Tesla supercharger network, which is plentiful, but they also work. Like, Tesla's charging reliability is just outstanding, and it boggles my mind why other car makers don't think that they should try and match that. Like, Rivian is clearly having a bit of a crack at it, but I think other car companies really should too, because left to third parties, it's just never as reliable, where they don't have the same vested interest that Tesla has in maintaining a great charging network. So, you know, with the ChargeFox chargers we have in Sydney for non-Teslas, including 350 kilowatt chargers near our office, you know, there was a bug getting this car to start charging. No fault of Polestar, simply that the cables that ChargeFox have at our local charger are just too heavy, so they have to be pulled down. You have to support the weight of the charger, wait for the charge session to start, yada yada. It's just a bit complicated, you know? Like, you don't have that problem with a Model 3, and that's something that car makers and third-party charging providers need to sort out pretty soon if we're going to be asked to buy these sorts of cars that are otherwise pretty good cars. Now, on the safety front, this car perhaps doesn't have as many standard safety features as you might expect for a Volvo-derived vehicle, and it's largely about trying to get it to that low entry price. You do get Ford's AEB as standard, you do get lane keep assist as standard, but you have to pay more on the Pilot pack if you want features like reversing AEB, blind spot monitoring, and front and rear cross traffic assist, plus a 360-degree camera. Those sorts of things are increasingly becoming standard fitment on combustion vehicles of this price, even from mainstream brands. So to have to pay more on that pack is not all that impressive, but I can certainly see that they felt the pressure to get the entry price for this car as low as possible. So those are my first impressions of the new Polestar 2, the first mid-size EV to arrive in Australia to seriously compete with a vehicle like the Tesla Model 3, which has been the absolute juggernaut in our market so far. Now, the good news is I'm actually going to be running a Polestar 2 as a long-termer, so I'll be able to let you know over the next 6 months whether or not this vehicle actually stands up to daily driving, country road trips, highway stints, and what sort of economy you can really expect out of this car. So I'm very much looking forward to that, and you can certainly pose your questions to me down below that I'll get started on answering over the next few months. But certainly in terms of first impressions, this car seems to stand up. It is a little firm in terms of the ride quality from those big 20-inch wheels, but the interior is lovely. Subjectively, I think the design is really cool, and the purchase price and the running costs are attractively low. Keen to know your thoughts. Please put them below the video in the comments. We do read them all and get back to as many as we can. Make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.